Here we are. Where's that? Yeah, so we're going to talk about adrenal gland. Renal. Above the kidneys. Those two little thingies over here. Right here. Above the kidneys. Now, adrenal gland is one of the examples. The organ which has two layers. The superficial layer, called cortex, and the deep layer, called medulla. Now, we separate them not only anatomically, they look different, but we also distinguish them physiologically, because hormones produced in the adrenal cortex and in the adrenal medulla are structurally and physiologically different. Adrenal medulla hormones, you all know them, epinephrine, norepinephrine, or as they used to be called before, noradrenaline and adrenaline. Right? Sense? What causes the production of those hormones? When do you produce norepinephrine? When you're scared. Stress. It's going to be, it may be physical stress, emotional stress. Importantly, it's mostly acute stress. You're scared. There's something like, immediately something is going on. Okay, there's an attack, fight or flight. Exercise, same stuff. Your sympathetic system's activated. Okay, norepinephrine and epinephrine are water-soluble hormones derived from the same amino acid that thyroid hormone is derived. They derive from tyrosine, but chemically they're quite different. So thyroid hormone is fat-soluble. Okay. Epinephrine, norepinephrine are water-soluble. I'm not going to talk about these two because we got decent amount of coverage for them. We cover them a lot when we talk about sympathetic nervous system. What we're going to focus on are the hormones of the adrenal cortex. As I mentioned, cortex is superficial. It is divided into 3 zones. You can see the zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. And each zone, which honestly aren't very anatomically different from the, from the point of observation, each zone produces its own unique set of hormones, which have their own unique set of functions. Hormones of adrenal cortex are fat-soluble. They're all based on cholesterol. And they regulate stress responses. Some of them participate also in the blood pressure regulation. And the separate set regulates masculinization. They are androgens. With that said, we're going to chat about each zona and each set of hormones separately. Okay? So the first one, there's a lot of arrows. The first one is zona glomerulosa, the most superficial layer of the adrenal cortex. Produces the hormone that is called aldosterone. Okay? So what are the effects of, let's talk, okay? Because that's the best way to figure out. What are the effects of aldosterone? two major things. It increases sodium reabsorption in the kidneys. What does that mean? Increased sodium reabsorption in the kidneys. Reabsorption. Perfect. Kidneys take back the sodium and place it back into the blood. Does that make sense? That's effect number one. Effect number two, they increase potassium excretion. What does that mean? We get rid of potassium, yeah. So, let's talk about potassium first. If aldosterone increases potassium excretion, what would be the stimulus for aldosterone production? High potassium in the blood. That is absolutely right. That makes sense? Potassium is extremely tightly regulated. Potassium in extracellular fluid is extremely tightly regulated. Why? Yes, it does. What is the role of potassium at the cellular level? It goes through the channels. So, no. You're thinking in the right direction. You're good. So it contributes to which parameter of the cell membrane? Membrane potential. It's the one of two main contributors to the membrane potential. And if you screw up membrane potential, cells become hyperpolarized or depolarized. This whole thing just, cardiac activity depends on membrane potential, very tight regulation of it. How do we kill inmates? Capital punishment. How is it carried out in the United States? Potassium injection. Potassium chloride. Okay. It leads to the ventricular fibrillation and boom. Obviously, it's not only potassium chloride, but that's what kills people. Okay? Does that make sense? So that's one. Number two, sodium reabsorption. So sodium is taken back into the blood. So what would be the stimulus? Right thinking. Low sodium. The trick is sodium concentration in extracellular fluid varies very, very little. Let it sink in. Concentration of sodium in the blood or extracellular fluid is very stable. Okay? Now, when somebody has low sodium, it refers not exactly to the concentration, but to the overall amount. Let me explain what I mean. Well, it's kind of easier to explain an example of rather high sodium. So imagine you eat a lot of salty food, a lot of sodium. Okay? When, say, you have a can of pickles and you eat the entire can in 5 minutes, so blood sodium will skyrocket. Or better example, ever heard about that infamous sandwich from KFC where they substituted bread with fried chicken? There was a burger in between. This sandwich, single sandwich, contained 2 or 3 daily doses of sodium. Just one sandwich. So imagine you eat this whole thing. Your blood sodium goes through the roof. Sodium has a very important function in the human body. It regulates osmosis. What is osmosis? Diffusion of water toward higher concentration of solutes, right? So when sodium in the blood goes up, water rushes into the blood. What do you when you eat something salty? What do you feel afterwards? Thirst. you have that compensatory mechanism, I need to drink. That's physiological response. You need to increase the water content. You need to bring the sodium concentration in the blood immediately to normal. And you drink, because if you don't, the water will be taken from your cells. Seriously, it will be. Does that make sense? So, sodium concentration will be kept at the same level. It's the content of sodium in the body that will differ. Does that make sense? So, aldosterone will reabsorb sodium and bring more sodium in the blood. What will follow the sodium? By osmosis. Water. Remember this phrase, water follows sodium. It actually regulates a lot of processes in the human body. If sodium turns out to be one of the main osmotic regulators. So sodium goes into the blood, water follows sodium, ends up in the blood. What happens to the volume of the blood? It increases. How does it change your blood pressure? It increases. This is the main response, that aldosterone produces. Why I said increase sodium absorption? Because it doesn't just directly increases blood pressure. It has to bring sodium in the blood. Sodium will draw water. Water will increase the volume. Increased volume will be manifested at high blood pressure. Does this make sense, this chain of events? Okay? So, what would be the stimulus for aldosterone production? There you go, low blood pressure. Does that make sense? That's it. Okay? Another thing that aldosterone will do, this. Thirst. Okay? Low blood pressure will stimulate centers in the hypothalamus that are responsible for the thirst sensation. It's a conscious sensation. You know you're thirsty. Does that make sense? So that's the function of aldosterone. Bring back blood pressure. Okay, and you can see here, this graph, it shows it very nicely. So you have low volumes of extracellular fluid. Aldosterone increases, volume of extracellular fluid increase. Okay? Does that make sense? A lot of, and extracellular fluid means blood, really. Okay? Now, when blood pressure goes up, what happens to the flow of blood through your kidneys? Huh? Think about this. You have a plumbing system, and you increase the pressure in the plumbing system. The flow through any part of this plumbing system will increase, right? So you have more blood coming through your kidneys in the given moment. How will it be reflected in the volume of urine that you produce? Yeah, it's gonna go up. You're gonna start peeing more. Does that make sense? So that shows you, it's a teeter-totter. Blood pressure is low, aldosterone is produced, increases sodium reabsorption. Sodium draws in water. Water increases the volume of blood. Increased volume contributes to the higher blood pressure. If it overshoots, filtration through the kidneys will increase and you will pee out all excessive water. Does that make sense? Perfect. Actually, aldosterone is the component of the whole regulation system that is called renin, angiotensin, aldosterone. I have several steps here. That low blood pressure first activates the hormone called renin, which is produced in the kidney. Renin activates angiotensin, which is produced in liver. And angiotensin finally activates aldosterone, which is produced in adrenal cortex. Does that make sense? Okay? So far, do you understand the whole idea of, and this is going to be one of the main features of cardiovascular physiology and renal regulation, stuff like that. Because you can easily alter blood pressure by changing the blood volume. How do you change the blood volume? You increase the amount of water that goes into the blood. How do you change it? You cause thirst, you drink. You can put in more sodium, so water will be drawn towards sodium into the blood. Or it's not a matter here, but technically you can start peeing less. Okay? Make sense? Another thing that stimulates aldosterone production, stress. I'm talking mostly about chronic stress. When you experience chronic stress, and it can be stress of all sorts, but of course we are mostly interested in psychological stress. Okay? Whatever, pick your favorite type of psychological stress. That stimulates, one of the outcomes is stimulation of zona glomerulosa. Aldosterone is directly increased. That directly leads to sodium reabsorption, water going into the blood, elevated blood volume, elevated blood pressure. Does that make sense? That's why when you are under stress all freaking time, you develop hypertension. Got it? Now, we're going to talk about this hormone again, but we always need to think, okay, blood pressure. If it's low, we have renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. We're good, right? What if it's very high? In this case, high blood pressure normally is sensed by the cells in the heart that will produce, those cells in the heart will produce atrial natriuretic peptide. So atrial natriuretic peptide will block aldosterone production. So what's going to happen to sodium reabsorption? It's going to decrease. Since reabsorption in the kidneys goes down, all that sodium that is not reabsorbed, where does it go? It's excreted with what? How do we call it? Eventually. Huh? Water, urine. Yeah, it's excreted in urine. Now, if you increase the concentration of sodium in the urine, sodium will be followed by water. Water will be drawn from your extracellular fluid to your urine. Does that make sense? What's going to happen to the volume of extracellular fluid, which will lose water? It's going to decrease. So volume of your blood is going to decrease and your blood pressure decrease. So you see, by either keeping sodium in or letting it out, you can regulate the volume of the extracellular fluid / blood, regulate blood pressure as the outcome. Does that make sense? Okay. Got it? So aldosterone is fat soluble. They're all fat soluble. Cortisol is fat soluble. Aldosterone is fat soluble. They're all based on cholesterol. Therefore, receptor is inside of the cell. It's called mineralocorticoid receptor. It's fine. Aldosterone binds receptor complex. Binds to the DNA. You have RNA. You have RNA is translated into proteins. An interesting thing are which proteins produced. Okay, so there's proteins that are produced as a result of aldosterone synthesis. They will increase the number of sodium channels and sodium-potassium pumps in the kidney cells. So this pump right here will move sodium into the extracellular fluid. Does that make sense? So that movement of sodium from the cell to extracellular fluid will drive the diffusion of sodium from the urine into the cell. It will create a flow from the urine into the extracellular fluid. Does that make sense? I think it's just mechanistically, I think it's pretty awesome. You increase the levels of channels on one side, pumps on another, you have the flow lines immediately established. And if you inhibit, another pretty cool stuff, you inhibit mineralocorticoid receptor. If you inhibit the receptor for aldosterone, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to the complex between receptor and aldosterone? You inhibit receptor, you block it. Come on. It's not a tricky question. You're going too far. Wait. You block the receptor. Is there any complex? No, because you blocked the receptor. It's not working anymore, right? There's no complex between hormone and receptor. Is there any transcription? No. Is there any translation? No. Are these proteins established in the membrane? No. Is there sodium reabsorption? No. So where does sodium stay? Huh? Not in the bloodstream. Reabsorption means that it gets back into the bloodstream. If there is no reabsorption, it stays in the urine. It stays in the urine. And since it stays in the urine, what does it draw with it? Water. So volume of urine increases. A drug called spironolactone is the diuretic. It blocks the receptor. Okay? Same way, well, another diuretic, miloride. You block the channel for sodium. Sodium cannot leave the urine. It stays in the urine, draws water with it, diuretic. Does that make sense? Okay. Please, for aldosterone, what I want you to focus on, forget about, but those diuretics, they're pretty cool, kind of clinical relevance and all, but I want you to focus now on the stimuli and the outcomes. Okay? High potassium, we get rid of potassium. Low blood pressure, we bring sodium in, bring water in, elevate blood volume and blood pressure. We good? Does that make sense? Potassium is important, so if somebody has too much aldosterone, hypertension, low potassium, we keep getting rid of it, which leads to the muscle weakness and alkalosis. Let me put it this way. Low potassium means low hydrogen. Low hydrogen means high pH, alkalosis. Okay? Alkalosis, for instance, in people with neurological abnormalities may provoke overactivation of neurons. Deficiency of aldosterone, low blood pressure, too much potassium, which is horrible, okay, which leads to cardiac arrhythmias and eventually death. Okay. Does that make sense? So again, if we increase this, what's going to happen downstream? If we increase that, what's going to happen downstream? It's all about step by step. Are we clear? Moving on. Cortisol, that's hormone of stress. So stress is anything that is not environmentally normal. A former colleague of mine was working on immunological responses to stress in mice. So I want to give you an example what the stressors were. For instance, hypokinesia. He put mice in the tube. So they were stuck in the tube for a certain period of time. They couldn't move for several hours. Hypothermia. Not terrible hypothermia, but hypothermia that mice could survive. Hyperthermia. Okay. They also developed a very interesting model of psychophysiological stress. They placed food so mouse could smell it, but it had to go through the maze to get to the food. So it wasn't straightforward. That was interesting stress. All those stressors lead to the production of cortisol in the end. The first thing is corticotropin releasing hormone produced in the hypothalamus. Okay, so you can see it right here. I have it now. Okay, CRH. Okay, corticotropin releasing hormone is then delivered to the anterior pituitary right here, where it stimulates adrenocorticotropic hormone. That's a long name. Wait. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, acts on zona fasciculata in the adrenal cortex and stimulates the release of cortisol. That makes sense? This is called hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. The reason for it is also the cortisol is called glucocorticoid. We'll talk why. When cortisol levels increase, they're going to act on hypothalamus and on the anterior pituitary, and they will block production of ACTH and CRH. Does it make sense? Remember, we were drawing the scheme for thyroid regulation. Remember? Here, it's very similar. CRH, ACTH, cortisol. Well, like effects, okay? Does that make sense? Do you see here the similarity, the same pattern? And what are the main effects of cortisol? Probably first and foremost, it's an increase in blood glucose. Okay. Cortisol increases blood glucose to give you energy to combat stress. It also breaks down fat as an additional source of energy, and it suppresses the immune system. Okay. Reduces inflammation. Okay. And since, probably because of those zones, zona glomerulosa and zona fasciculata, very close to each other, they lead to elevated aldosterone as well. Stress leads to elevated aldosterone as well. So long-term effect of the stress, kidneys retain water. They keep sodium in, water's in, blood volume increases, blood pressure increases. Does that make sense? But what I want you, metabolic effect of cortisol is elevated blood sugar. Are we clear? That's metabolic effect of cortisol. Okay, moving on. Now, how can you increase the blood sugar? Now we're going to talk a lot of, long compound words. How can you get blood sugar elevated? Eat something sweet. Yes, you can eat something. Let's say you do not have a source of food right now. Can you get the glucose, like endogenous glucose? Yes, from where? Say again? Biochemically, yes, you can, but it's going to be like 33rd source. First to-go molecule, glycogen. So the first thing is glycogenolysis. Do you remember what glycogen is? If don't, no problem. When you have a lot of glucose, when you eat, glucose that is not immediately used is stored in your muscle and liver in the form of glycogen, polymer. It's like animal starch. Plants store glucose in the form of starch, animals store it in the form of glycogen. We good? So when you need glucose, you break glycogen into bits, and each bit is the glucose. Does that make sense? Another way, make it from scratch, called gluconeogenesis. Glucose stands for glucose, neo stands for new, genesis stands for making. Does that make sense? Okay. These words are really, really important because I'm going to use these terms in the questions. And you must know what they mean. So don't come at the exam. If you come and ask me, gluconeogenesis, what is that? I will not help you. I will not answer that. If I use it in the question, you got to know that. So gluconeogenesis is making glucose from scratch. Glycogenolysis is glycogen lysis. Glycogen is glucose polymer. Lysis is to break it down to get glucose. Does that make sense? Both these processes, gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis, will increase your blood sugar that you potentially need to combat stress. Okay? Make sense? Since you gotta get sources of energy, it's like somewhat like growth hormone. The only difference, it doesn't promote growth itself. Proteins are going to be broken down as the potential source of energy. And lipids, lipolysis. Lipolysis refers to the breakdown of lipids. Are we clear? Okay. So, if you ever experienced severe stress in your life, extended severe stress, the first physiological change that you may have noticed, you lose weight. In my life, there was a period, about several months, I was under enormous stress. I did not exercise at all. I lost one hole in my belt. Like, I lost size in my waist. Okay? I didn't do any like active thing except like walking from the car into the car. But I lost enormous amount of, probably most effective, weight control measure in my life. Okay? However, interesting thing, if people are exposed to the stressor for an extended period of time, they develop eventually obesity. We don't know the exact mechanism, but one of the proposed mechanisms, compensatory effect. You just feel good when you eat. It's a nervous response. Some of the chemicals that are produced when you eat have structures similar to opioids, the hormones in your hypothalamus. So they may stimulate the reward from eating, and you just try to compensate for the stress. Okay. Now this upper line shows what the word cortisol increases. The bottom line shows you what it decreases. And it decreases, everything's opposite. So it decreases glycolysis. What is glycolysis? Glycolysis. Breakdown of what? Sugar, glucose, right? It happens in the cells. So if you break down sugar in the cells, there's not enough sugar to put in the blood. So you have to stop breaking down sugar in the cells and get all available glucose in the blood. Does that make sense? It stops protein synthesis, because you may need proteins as the energy source. You cannot afford to make new ones. Does that make sense? Okay. It prevents lipogenesis, which is synthesis of fats, because you're going to use fats as the energy source. You can't afford to make them. Does that make sense? It also reduces your immune response, which is good and bad. Right? When you're stressed, herpes, unlike true love, it's always with you. You don't have to get sick, physiologically sick, to get herpes. If you're stressed, really stressed, for an extended period of time, you may have a cold sore. Okay? Your immune system goes down, latent virus reactivates. Okay? When you're stressed, you're more prone to infections. It is true, really. You can quantitatively see number of dendritic cells in your tissues, or number of macrophages or monocytes. They go down when you're stressed, really. Like, your immune system is suppressed. Good side, you can use cortisol as the anti-inflammatory treatment. People with chronic inflammatory conditions, like, say, asthma or eczema, they can use cortisol as the treatment, because it will suppress the inflammation. Does that make sense? This picture shows you, that arrow shows when the stress was exerted, and then you can see, cortisol goes up in rats. It's rats. Expose them to stress and cortisol goes up. It takes minutes, not seconds. Okay. The receptor for the hormone, of course, is intracellular. You should be professionals now. You're pros in this recognition. It's fat-soluble hormone. So receptors in the cell, complex is formed, interacts with DNA, and the usual shtick with, going down the line. Make sense? Again, either too much or too low. I mean, if you start taking... Now, why cortisol is called glucocorticoid? What does it regulate? Glucose levels, right? It increases glucose levels. Same way, aldosterone is called mineralocorticoid, because it regulates minerals, sodium and potassium. Okay? Cortisol is good as anti-inflammatory, suppress immunity. You can treat a bunch of diseases, but you shouldn't overuse it, especially systemically. Topical treatments, fine, you're not going to increase levels too much, but chronic systemic exposure to cortisol leads to the condition known as Cushing's disease. So this is the photos of the same patients before and after the onset of Cushing's disease. Constantly elevated blood glucose, and together with increased food consumption, leads to the obesity or overweight. Also, the features are very specific. It's a so-called buffalo hump and moon face. You can't appreciate it, sideways, but in front it's kind of a little bit swollen face. Okay. Hypertension, of course. Does that make sense? Treatment is usually adrenectomy, removal of adrenal glands. It's treatable, it's manageable condition. It's the condition that people live with. Addison's disease is the deficit, chronic deficit of glucocorticoids. In this case, due to the, lack of an important component of blood glucose regulation, the person becomes really tired, fatigued. One of the sites is the skin darkening. So JFK was suffering from Addison's disease, and he started the course, and I think it was, as far as I remember, was kind of covered. Nobody wanted the presidential candidate suffering from being weak. He started a course of glucocorticoids, and look, until 1963, he looked and felt fine. Okay? So, increase, decrease. By the way, one of the consequences of stress sometimes is type 2 diabetes. Does that make sense? Constantly elevated blood glucose levels may lead to diabetes. Now the third zone, zona reticularis, it produces sex hormones. Now, interesting thing about, so the thing about these sex hormones is that they are very much secondary to, what is the main site that produces sex hormones in the human body? In the male body. Testis. In a female. Ovaries. So those are main sources, okay? Adrenal glands, they have kind of supplement role, okay? They produce androgens, but amounts are fairly low. In women, they thought to contribute to the sex drive because it's known sex drive in both men and women is largely mediated by testosterone levels. So since those androgens that are produced by adrenal glands are androgens, so they are testosterone-like hormones, they contribute to the sex drive. In men, we don't really know. They can serve as a backup, okay? And actually, well, look at it. So think about this. In males, levels of testosterone stay fairly elevated through the entire lifetime. Men do not experience the abrupt drop in the levels of gonadal hormones. Okay, so, we don't need that supplement. In females, there's a moment in life that is called menopause, when estrogen levels go down abruptly. Okay, in this case, androgens can be converted into the estrogen. Okay, so they may supply some of that estrogen that is needed for calcium balance, for God's sake. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, very fascinating. I love this story. Adrenogenital or androgenital syndrome. It's very elegant example of endocrine regulation. It all starts with the lack of glucocorticoids no glucocorticoids whatsoever. So no cortisol is produced. Now, remind me please how hypothalamus-pituitary-adrenal axis looks like. Hypothalamus produces CRH, which stimulates ACTH, which eventually stimulates production of cortisol. Yep. Effects, whatever. Okay. Cortisol, which effect does it have on CRH and ACTH? Say again? Yeah, it inhibits them. It stops them, yes. Does that make sense? There's no cortisol. What's going to happen to the levels of CRH and ACTH? They're going to be through the roof. Yeah, they're going to increase in an attempt to get some glucocorticoids in the blood. They're not going to succeed because it's like genetic lack, okay? But ACTH is going to stimulate the entire adrenal cortex across the board, including zona reticularis, which will lead to the, well, hyperplasia of adrenal cortex, okay, and elevated testosterone-like androgens, which will lead to the masculinization in females. Facial hair, okay, more solid bones, okay. In males, interestingly enough, it will lead to the hypospadias, the ambiguous genitalia. So if you would look, it's the gland penis, and this is the reduced vaginal orifice. Hypospadias can be surgically corrected. It's kind of, I mean, it's done in newborns, fairly straightforward. Okay, but then they should be on hormones for the rest of their lives. Does that make sense? Well, you know what? Let's just wrap it up for now. Just from the logical standpoint, we'll talk about posterior pituitary and pancreas later. Please collect the quiz and the scantron. Bring them on Wednesday.